Hi, everyone. My name is Christopher Shaw. I was actually till recently a head of research at Climate Outreach, and now working as a freelance consultant on the subject of climate risk communication. So, very apt opportunity today. And thank you very much for the chance to talk to you about awareness raising. More generally, I guess today Pete's asked if I just sort of focus on awareness raising around climate change more generally, and I think that's come through from your discussions about what you like to focus on. So I'll crack on. But obviously, when we're thinking about risk, we're thinking about coastal flooding, about coastal communities. And I think the reason why this work is so important, and it's certainly a guiding principle for me, and hopefully it's something you can take forward, is to unless we've got a shared understanding of the risks that climate change poses for us, then we can't really, as societies, organise effectively to cope with those risks and live with those risks. And as a result, the suffering that will occur from those impacts will be greater. So that's why the work that you're involved with around this citizens' jury, citizens' assembly, is so very important. Now, at climate outreach, so the thing is, right, you could, if you just, and I'm sure this has come up in your conversations already, but like if you just talk about the science of climate change, if you just talk about the numbers of climate change, if you just talk about what's going to happen 30 years from now, etc., then that's not very kind of engaging for people. When you're raising awareness, people aren't really thinking in terms of graphs and maths and science, right? It's mostly like an emotional response, and it's about our values. It's about the kind of world we want to live in. And it's about who we trust, who are those messages coming from? Do we trust that person? And can we see ourselves in the stories that we're hearing that that person is telling us? And that's really key to build the awareness. Ultimately, you can make people aware of the risk, you can make people aware of climate change and what's happening. And that's an important part of the story. I mean, it doesn't mean that you've done that. People are aware, and now they'll adopt behaviours to reduce their carbon of their lifestyle. It doesn't follow like that. It's much more complicated. But look, what it does do, if you get this first bit right, is it stops people sort of shutting the door in your face. Okay, so you can start the conversation and you can continue that conversation. Whereas if you don't really speak to where people are at in terms of their values and worldviews, then you're not even going to be able to begin the conversation. So this model that was developed by an organisation called More in Common, which is about 7 segments, was Climate Outreach have adapted that, working with More in Common, to say, well, what does it mean when we talk about climate change with these 7 segments? And I've not got time to go into it in detail today, but on the Climate Outreach website, if you look at Britain Talks Climate, there's a full explanation. But let me just give you a quick example. So when I worked at Climate Outreach, so people who's kind of worried about climate change and live relatively low carbon lives, they would all come up as progressive activists. If we took the survey to see which segment we were in, we'd all be progressive activists. But there's a lot of interest in, say, I'll just talk about a couple of segments here, okay? And then I'll move on to the next slide. So, for example, the Loyal Nationals, now that's a group who are very concerned about climate change, but they're very engaged with politics, they're very vocal, but that's a group that are very distrusting of everyone. So trust becomes very important in conversations with people who sit within that segment. And we think about established liberals. These are people who tend to be very well off and are kind of worried about climate change. They're not very political, and they're looking for technological solutions. Backbone conservatives, very politically engaged. Civic pragmatists, again, not very political. Then you have these disengaged segments who really, where you might find a lot of kind of more skepticism about the climate science. So this model is used by a lot of people to help them understand how to talk about climate change in a way that sort of closes that gap, as it were. Now it's called the organisation did this called More in Common because the premise is that actually what unites us, despite all the differences politically and worldviews, is stronger than what divides us. So when actually you ask people what worries you about climate change, why are you worried about climate change? We see across the segments that actually the harm to nature and wildlife is the key driver of people's concern about climate change. I worry about climate change, so I worry about what it means for the impact on nature. I'm worried about the impact on wildlife. So this is a strong, and for progressive activists, as you might get from the name, they're kind of more worried about people and equity and justice. But even so, the second most important cause of concern for them is harm to nature and wildlife. So when you think about raising awareness, it can be important to think about how climate change is going to impact on the ecosystems, the biodiversity, the landscape of Cornwall and surrounding areas. And that's a way that, and you'll find that's going to be a very engaging way to speak to people about that. And then we can see there's a number of other issues there, and the impact on people's bills is another concern. And of course, with the cost of living crisis, which is still with us, we can expect that still to be an issue. So again, when we think about raising awareness, we've got to think about, well, what are the messages that might show that perhaps climate action doesn't lead to bills and costs to rise, or what can be done to ameliorate that. And then the third most common one is about impact on other people, whether that's the world's poorest or on our children's future. So across the divides, across these different kind of political worldviews, there's some strong patterns of how we can think about the things we want to talk about when we're raising awareness on climate change that we should speak to. I don't know how well I'm doing for time. I haven't actually got that many more slides. I've got this slide, and then I'm going to finish with one other point.
Can you hear me now? Can you hear me
Yeah.
now? I was just going to give you sort of just over 2 minutes left.
Brilliant. Perfect timing. So one of the things you can do, and actually using those segments and using, if you were in that area, you wanted to build support for campaigns or awareness about coastal impacts of sea level rise and on climate change on sea level rise and life on the coast. There's some great work being done using something like Facebook and using those segments to target your messaging, and you can use different images and different wording, and you can test it, and then you can actually build sort of support for your campaign through these online mechanisms. And this particular campaign, which was looking at, as you can see, building support for a group that really wanted to pressure the government on doing more to protect our coastlines from the impact of climate change. That was able actually to recruit people to this campaign at a cost of something like 81 pence per person who signed up, which is very good value for money when you're building a campaign. So that's just something to think about, how you can use these tools to raise that awareness. And my final point, I've got no slides, but research we've done on adaptation and living with the impacts of climate change, there's not a lot of work on here. But what I would say, one key message that came through, the time to talk about climate change is not when an area has been flooded or been hit by climate change. At that point, people are dealing with problems, emotional trauma, sorting out their lives and coping with the impacts of it. That you might think, oh, right, then we can talk about climate change now. That will really build awareness. This is the time. Tends to not be at the time. People got other things to worry about. So it's just a word of advice if you're moving forward with any sort of campaigns to build awareness. If that's something to think about. Thanks very much for your attention.